Ninjago Dragons Rising Season 2 Part 2 introduced us to the Tournament of the Sources. That is a tournament that is participated in by every Elemental Master in the City of Temples, and it is made to honour the Source Dragons, and honestly, I think it's an extremely cool concept. And even though Sora did end up winning the tournament, we never really got to see an authentic version of what that tournament could actually look like, because throughout the entirety of the season, it was being tampered with and rigged by Bleckt and the Wolf Clan. And honestly, it's honestly a shame just to see that that is how it went down, because I would love to see what the tournament would have looked like if it was completely fair. And that is what I want to talk about today. What if the Tournament of the Sources was never actually interfered with and we actually got to see what it would look like in the authentic sense? What if we never actually got any sort of interference? Would the outcome would have been different? Would Sora still have won the tournament? There's a lot of different questions when it comes down to it. And honestly, this is going to be my interpretation of the Tournament of Sources if there was no rigged matches. And I also do want to know what you guys think of this interpretation. Do you agree with the answer I'm going to give at the end? I honestly think it is a very interesting outcome, and I would love to know what you guys think of it. Because I will say this, and I want to get this out of the way very quickly, even though there are rigged matches, and for reference I'm using the wiki as reference on what is classed as a rigged match and what wasn't, I will also specify that just because a match was rigged doesn't necessarily mean I think the outcome would have been different. There may be some matches where I think it would have still been the same outcome, because rigging just ultimately means you're guaranteeing the winner instead of leaving it up to chance. But yeah, let me not waste any more of your time, and let's talk about the Tournament of the Sources if it wasn't rigged. Now, the very first match of the tournament was in fact rigged. Zer vs Zane was a rigged match from the very beginning. Zane ultimately was going to do a strike on Zer that would have potentially have won in the match, but the elemental power of ice was removed from the floor, so Zer would have been able to maneuver it and be able to win against him. Do I think the outcome would have been any different? Yeah. Now, this isn't me putting down the abilities of Zer, because he is a very fierce competitor, but one thing I will note is the fact that even though Zane did look a little bit confused during the fight, and he looked a little bit overwhelmed in the fight, you will find that Zane was able to outmaneuver Zer when it came down to it. Zer in his elemental power, Zane was still able to freeze him where he stood, and in my opinion, the blow that Zane was going to do against him would have taken Zer out of the tournament. So in this case, the very first rigged match would have gone differently. I believe Zane would have beaten Zer, and Zane would have remained within the competition. This would mean that any fight that Zer took on after this point is now going to be in the place of Zane, and I will do that as we go along for any character that is officially in or out of the tournament. So we're going to have to keep track of certain things when it comes down to it, but as of now, Zane is going to be taking the place of Zer in any of the future fights. We do get a couple of different fights after this point, but none of them are actually rigged. Nia vs Jay wasn't, Sora vs Kizzy, Cinder vs Wildfire, Zeatrix vs Euphrasia, Noct vs Tox, Lloyd vs Mr. Pale. All of those were completely fair fights and they weren't interfered with at all. The next rigged fight, however, was Frack vs Cole, and Frack was ultimately slated to be able to win it, and Cole was going to be taken out of the tournament accordingly. And again, in similar vein, I think Cole would have beaten Frack if it was a fair fight. And this doesn't necessarily come down to any sort of interference within the fight, it's the fact that this fight is clearly slated towards Frack's powers. Remember, this is suspended up in the air, where Frack's abilities was able to be used quite effectively, whereas Cole's powers were basically taken away from him for the entire course of the fight. So it's not like there was an initial instance where something happened to change the outcome, it's more the fact that the entire fight was centered around the abilities of Frack. So in this scenario, they would have had an arena that was more slated towards the two of them, and in that sense, I would definitely say that Cole would have been the winner in this instance. Is it fair to change the entire setup of the fight? Not really, but at the same time, like we said, the implication is the fact that this fight was entirely slated towards the abilities of Frack. So if the fight was to be fair, it would be set somewhere where Cole could actually use his elemental powers. So that is why I'm saying that Cole would be the victor in this instance. The fight right after this as well was rigged. It was Noct versus Nia, and this is the most definitive instance of rigging actually taking place. The key to victory was definitive definitively moved from Nia's position to favour Noct instead, and that is how Noct ended up winning the fight. And honestly, for that alone, it definitively shows that Noct would have lost and Nia would have continued within this fight. And even then, Nia was outsmarting Noct when it came to elemental power as well. So I do find it really interesting to note that Nia would have completely bodied Noct when it actually comes down to it. So this kind of just changes things anyway, because now Noct is no longer even in the tournament. So now we have to consider all the ninja remaining within the tournament, whilst also getting rid of the main competitor and a couple other of the notable people. After this though is quite interesting, because even though we don't really have much in the way of rigged fights, we do have fights that are now different because of who is actually still in the tournament. For example, after Noct vs Nia is Sora vs Cinder, which is completely fine, that goes on as usual. But after that is Frack vs Zer, which means instead of those two, it would have been Cole vs Zayn. And in that instance, similar to how the actual outcome comes out, I do think Cole would have beaten Zayn in this instance. So instead of Zayn basically being last place in the tournament, Zayn would have actually been quite high up when it comes to the overall ranking. So unfortunately, we're gonna have to pit the two ninja against each other, and in this instance, Cole is officially beating out Zayn. We're then again back to more of the fights that don't really have any sort of impact. Geo versus Gorge, which is fine. Lloyd versus a Crack, which is fine. Algu versus Telk. Zeatrix versus Maud. All of them are going on as they usually would. But the next one that would technically be altered is the Noct versus Neuro fight would actually be Nia versus Neuro. And in my opinion, in similar vein to how this fight actually does happen, I do think Nia would have completely beaten Neuro. So nothing really changed apart from the fact that Nia would have fought against the Master of the Mind, but she does continue on in the tournament regardless. And then after that fact, Lloyd versus Geo would have continued on, and Zeatrix versus Algu would have been the same thing again. It is interesting to note that by this point we are getting towards the end of the tournament and most of the ninja are still within the fight. I mean, the only person who is actually out by now is actually Zayn, and that is because he only lost to Cole. But it does continue on basically like normal for a while, because you'll find Sora versus Camille would have ended the same, Lloyd versus Zeatrix would have still have ended the same, and I will find it interesting to note that even though we don't know when these matches happen specifically, we know Obscura at some point fights against someone and loses, and Frack wins against someone at some point, so Cole would have won another match at some point during all of this. And I will say as well, the Lloyd versus Zeatrix fight would have been unaltered in the fact that Zeatrix would have still have struck Lloyd and put him in a coma because that had nothing to do with the rigging of the fight itself. So what you'll find is that everything is still basically happening on the exact same way. But here is where things honestly get interesting for me, and it is the Sora versus Frack fight, where Sora ends up winning, but in this case, it would actually be Sora against Cole. And honestly, I have had a very big back and forth when it comes to this fight, because I would like to think that Sora would still stand a chance when it comes down to it. But at the same time, when you actually do look back at that fight, you will find that Frack only just barely loses. Sora only really wins by the skin of her teeth, and it does call into question how Sora would have fought against someone with a bit more experience. Now, of course, she does also technically have fights with other much more experienced competitors, but in this instance, if you replace Frack with Cole and give him the exact same elemental powers, I'm honestly questioning if Sora would have won. And like I said, I spent the majority of the research of this video deciding on whether or not this fight would have had the exact same outcome or not. And honestly, considering everything that has come down to it, I honestly think Cole would have beaten Sora in this fight. I love how both of them even utilize all their elemental ability, but like I said, when you look back at that fight, Sora only barely won in that instance, and in my opinion, Frack is just so much less experienced when it comes down to it in comparison to Cole. So if you gave Cole the exact same abilities and the exact same version of Sora for that fight, I honestly think Cole would have beat Sora. After that did then come, in the story at the very least, the Noct versus Lloyd fight, but in this instance it would actually have been Nia versus Lloyd. But the thing is that the outcome would have still have been the exact same way. Lloyd, by the rules, had to withdraw from the fight. Now you can make the argument that maybe Bleckt wouldn't have pointed it out because he only did it to save Noct, but at the same time, if it was the rules, it probably still would have had to have been pointed out anyways. So in this case, Lloyd would have lost to Nia. So in this case, the final match comes down to two completely different people. The final game doesn't come down to Noct and Sora anymore. It comes down to Nia versus Cole. And in this instance, I would be very curious to know who you guys would think would win in this instance. And I do have, honestly, a theory when it comes down to it. And I don't think you would expect it at all. Now, I will say I did have to remove my bias when it came to this final matchup, because in my opinion, Cole is my favorite ninja and one of the best ninja we've ever had within the show. But when it comes down to it, and with this final fight, I truly believe the winner of the Tournament of Sources would have been Nia. I think it would have been an extremely close fight, but when it truly came down to it, I honestly believe that Nia would have been able to beat out Cole. I think, like I said, it would have been extremely close, but I think when it comes down to the brass tacks of it all, I think Nia would have been able to outmaneuver Cole and utilize her elemental abilities a lot better on. So, I think instead of Cole or Noct or Sora winning the tournament, I think it would have truly have come down to Nia, the Master of Water, the greatest elemental master. I do think I'm going to get a lot of people say that I am wrong when it comes down to it, but using the logic that I have, I truly do think it does come down to those two in the final fight, and I do think Nia does beat Cole. But like I said, I think Cole got taken out of the fight in one of the most unfair way possible, and I do think if you replace Cole with Frack, I do think Cole would have gone a lot further than Frack did when it came down to it, and honestly, I do stand by what I have done here. There are still so many other aspects you could consider, because I do know a lot of people do believe that Lloyd would have won the Tournament of Sources, but the whole thing with Zeatrix is completely separate from the rigging that was happening during the tournament. So I don't think Lloyd's outcome honestly would have been any different. You could consider, like I said, the idea that Bleckt wouldn't have pointed out that he is disqualified, but at the same time, I do think when it comes down to it, you have to acknowledge the fact that he was taken out technically down to the rules. So if Lloyd wasn't taken out, you could probably argue he would have won, but using the logic that we do have from the show, Lloyd still would have had to have come out anyways. But that is my opinion on how the Tournament of Sources would have been different if you consider the idea of nothing being rigged. And we do have a list of the 24 places that everyone came in when it came down to it, and the actual list is on the wiki. But if you were to adjust it in accordance with the new ranking that I have given, instead of Zane at 24th, it would have been Zer. It then goes Jay, Kizzy, Wildfire, Euphrasia, Tox, Mr. Pale. Instead of Cole at 17th, it would have been Frack. Instead of Nia at 16th, it would have been Noct. And then you go Cinder, Zane instead of Zer at 14th, Okrak, Zelk, Gorge, Maud, Neuro, Geo, Algu, Camille, Zeatrix 5th, Sora 4th, Lloyd 3rd, Cole 2nd, Nia 1st. What do you think of that ranking? But like I said, I would love to know what you guys think of what I have talked about here today. Do you disagree with what I have said about the ranking? Do you agree? Do you like the logic that I have used? Or do you think any of the fights would have had a different outcome? I would love to know what you think, because this is so down to interpretation, and this is purely my interpretation. I want to make that abundantly clear. But like I said, I would love to know what you guys would do with the exact same information on your hands. But that is about it for today, you guys. And thank you very much for watching. Take care. Okay,